Welcome to today's deep dive, where we'll be exploring excerpts from Arthur Koestler's 1967 book, The Ghost in the Machine.
Yeah.
We'll be delving into his fascinating ideas about the human mind and the human condition.
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking book.
Yeah.
Koestler really challenges the way we think about ourselves,
Yeah.
digging deep into biology, psychology, even history, to question some of the prevailing scientific theories of his time.
Yeah, and one of the things that really jumps out at me is his critique of what he calls the poverty of psychology,
Right.
especially the limitations of behaviorism.
Yeah,
He basically says, hey, humans are way more complex than rats in a Skinner box.
that's right. He takes issue with this idea that all human behavior can be boiled down to simple stimulus and response chains.
Yeah.
Like the classic Pavlovian dog experiment, ring a bell, the dog salivates.
Right.
Koestler argues that this framework just doesn't hold up when you try to apply it to things like language and thought.
Yeah, and he uses a really great example to illustrate this point. He talks about a conversation and how if someone says, don't mention it,
Uh-huh.
you don't automatically respond with, what about lunch?
Right.
There's so much more going on
Exactly.
beneath the surface of our words.
And that's where Koestler's concept of the open-ended hierarchy comes in.
Yeah.
It's like imagine language as this incredibly intricate tree
Ah,
with roots, trunk branches, and leaves.
okay.
Each level builds on the one before it, and they all work together to create this complex dynamic system.
Right.
So we're not just responding to the literal words someone says,
Right.
but to all these layers of meaning and context.
So it's like a whole ecosystem of meaning at play.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And Koestler argues that this is one of the key things that sets human behavior apart from the kind of rigid, predictable responses you might see in a Skinner box.
Right. So it's not just a simple chain reaction.
Right.
That makes me think about a typist taking dictation.
Mm-hmm.
They hear the words, they type them, but there's actually a ton of processing happening in their
Yes.
brain.
Absolutely.
They're not just robots responding to stimuli.
You're right. And that leads us to one of Koestler's most important ideas, which he calls the holon.
Okay.
Now, the word might sound a little intimidating,
Yeah.
but the concept itself is pretty simple
Okay.
and really powerful.
Break it down for us.
Okay, so a holon is basically anything that's both a whole and a part at the same time.
Okay.
Think about yourself for a second. You are a complete individual,
Right.
a whole person, right?
Yeah.
But you're also part of a family, a community, a nation, all these larger wholes that you fit into.
Right.
That's the essence of a holon.
Okay.
And Koestler argues that this kind of structure is everywhere in nature and society.
So it's like those Russian nesting dolls
Yes.
where you have a smaller doll inside a bigger doll and so on.
That's a good analogy.
Each doll is a whole on its own, but it's also part of a larger whole.
Exactly. And Koestler gives some really vivid examples from biology, like how even if you take a sponge and separate it into individual cells, those cells can actually reorganize themselves back into a sponge.
Wow.
It highlights this incredible drive in holons towards both self-assertion,
Okay.
meaning maintaining their own individual identity,
Right.
and integration, cooperating as part of a larger system.
That's pretty mind-blowing. It's
Yeah.
it's like there's this built-in tension between being a separate entity and being part of something bigger.
Exactly. And Koestler argues that this interplay between self-assertion and integration is what gives complex systems like organisms and societies their stability and flexibility.
Okay.
It's what allows them to adapt and evolve.
So how does this all relate to evolution?
Well, that's a great question.
Is Koestler saying that evolution itself is like a giant holon?
He actually goes even further than that. Koestler takes a critical look at the traditional view of evolution.
Yeah.
The survival of the fittest and random mutations driving change.
Right.
He calls it the blind man's buff theory, suggesting it relies too much on pure chance.
And he uses the example of the panda's thumb, right?
That's the
It's
end.
not a real thumb at all, but a modified wrist bone.
Right.
How could such a complex adaptation arise
Yeah.
just through random mutations?
That's one of his key arguments.
Okay.
He doesn't deny the role of mutations,
Right.
but he thinks there must be more to the story.
So he's not just throwing out Darwin altogether?
No, not at all.
He's adding another layer to the puzzle.
Right. And that layer is what he calls the genetic microhierarchy.
Okay.
It's this idea that our genes aren't just operating as isolated units, but as part of a complex, interconnected system
Right.
with its own internal selection mechanisms.
So it's like evolution has a plan, a strategy,
Mm-hmm.
beyond just throwing the dice with mutations.
Koestler wouldn't necessarily say it's a conscious plan,
Okay.
but he definitely sees a pattern in how evolution unfolds.
Yeah.
And one of the key patterns he identifies is this idea of standardization of subassemblies.
Standardization of subassemblies.
Yes.
That sounds like something an engineer would say.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's part of Koestler's point.
Okay.
He's saying that evolution often reuses existing structures in novel ways, much like an engineer might use standard parts to build different machines.
Okay, so give us an example of this in nature.
Well, think about the evolution of reptiles from amphibians.
Okay.
Amphibian young are aquatic, but
Mhm.
reptiles lay their eggs on land.
Yeah,
This was a huge step in conquering the continents,
right.
but it created a problem. How does a reptile embryo develop in a dry environment?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Right.
It seems like a big evolutionary leap.
Exactly. And Koestler argues that to make this leap,
Okay.
evolution had to take a step back in a way.
Uh-huh.
Reptile embryos developed a membrane within the egg that mimics the aquatic environment of their amphibian ancestors.
So it's like evolution reactivated an old program,
Right.
then built on it to create something new.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay.
And this pattern of drawback to leap, as Koestler calls it, shows up again and again in the history of life.
Okay, so we've talked about behavior holons and evolution. Now let's get to the brain itself.
Okay.
Koestler dives into this idea of the three brains.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
This is where Koestler gets really fascinating.
Okay.
He draws on the triune brain model, which proposes that our brains are essentially made up of three interconnected layers: the reptilian brain, the old mammalian brain, and the new mammalian brain.
Wow.
Each layer represents a different stage in our evolutionary history
Uh-huh.
and contributes to our behavior in unique ways.
Wait, so you're saying we're walking around with these ancient ancestors
Yeah.
in our heads,
In a way.
influencing our every thought and action?
Yeah, it's kind of wild.
It's kind of freaky.
It's a bit mind-bending, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the reptilian brain, the oldest layer, is responsible for our basic survival instincts.
Okay.
Things like breathing heart rate
Uh-huh.
and the fight or flight response. Think of it as the keep you alive brain.
Makes sense.
Good.
It's the most primitive part of our brain,
Yeah.
but it's still running the show in a lot of ways.
Exactly. Then you have the old mammalian brain, also known as the limbic system.
Okay.
This is where our emotions live,
Yeah.
especially those related to self-preservation and social bonding.
Right.
It's the feel the feels brain, if you will.
Okay, and finally we have the new mammalian brain,
Yes.
the neocortex,
The neocortex.
which is the most recent evolutionary development. This is the one that gives us our higher cognitive abilities
Right.
like language reasoning and planning.
Right, it's the thinky brain,
Yeah.
the one that sets us apart from other animals.
But here's the catch.
Yeah.
Koestler argues that these three brains aren't always on the same page.
That's right.
Wait, hold on here. You're saying there's a battle going on inside our heads?
Not exactly a battle,
Okay.
but definitely a potential for conflict.
Okay.
Koestler describes the human brain as having a schizophysiology,
Oh.
a kind of split between the old and new brains,
Okay.
between the emotional and the rational.
Right.
And this disconnect, he argues, is at the root of many of humanity's struggles.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting.
Right.
So how does this schizophysiology actually play out in our behavior?
That's a great question.
And what does it have to do with Koestler's whole idea of the ghost in the machine?
Well, that's what we'll delve into next.
Yeah.
Is where Koestler's analysis becomes really thought-provoking
Okay.
and maybe a little unsettling.
All right, well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back and we'll
Yeah.
dive into that.
We'll unpack that a little bit more.
All right, we'll be right back. So we left off with this idea that our brains are kind of like a three-layer cake,
Yeah.
with each layer representing a different stage of evolution.
Right.
And sometimes those layers aren't exactly in sync.
Yeah.
Which leads to this schizophysiology that Koestler talks about. I'm starting to see how this could connect to the whole ghost in the machine concept, but can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, Koestler argues that this disconnect between our old and new brains, between our emotions and our reason, is at the heart of the human predicament.
Mm.
It's like we have this incredibly powerful machine in our heads,
Yeah.
but we haven't quite figured out how to use it properly.
That's a great analogy. It's like we're constantly hitting the wrong buttons
Right.
and getting these unintended, often disastrous consequences.
Exactly. And Koestler points out that the explosive growth of the neocortex, which happened relatively recently in our evolutionary history, was a truly unprecedented event.
Right.
Is what gave us our unique cognitive abilities.
Right.
But it also created this potential for inner conflict.
He makes a comparison to marsupials, right?
Yeah.
Something about their brains and how they evolve.
He uses them to illustrate how brain architecture can impact a species' evolutionary trajectory. Marsupials, even those that evolved to living trees, didn't develop the same level of cognitive complexity as placental mammals. Koestler suggests that the way their brains developed with the neocortex sort of wrapped around the esophagus
Wow.
limited their potential.
So it's like their brains hit an evolutionary roadblock
Right.
because of this physical constraint.
Exactly. And he wonders if humans might have a similar kind of design flaw, not in our esophagus,
Right.
but in the way our old and new brains are wired together.
So we're like these super smart monkeys with
Yeah.
a bit of an emotional time bomb
Well,
ticking away in our heads.
that might be a bit dramatic,
Okay.
but it does capture the essence of his argument.
Okay.
He sees this rapid expansion of the neocortex as a kind of evolutionary gamble, one that gave us amazing capabilities, but also left us vulnerable to these internal conflicts and contradictions.
And this is where the self-destructive tendencies come in, right?
Exactly.
The things that make us do things that seem irrational or even harmful to ourselves and others.
It's exactly. Koestler believes this disconnect between our old and new brains is why we see things like ideological fanaticism, mob mentality, and even the ritualistic violence that has plagued human history.
So it's like our primal urges, those deep-seated emotions driven by the old brain,
Right.
can sometimes hijack our higher reasoning abilities.
That's a good way to put it. He calls it a delusional streak
Mhm.
that runs through human history, evidenced by things like human sacrifices, witch hunts, and totalitarian regimes.
Yeah.
It's this misdirected urge for self-transcendence where our desire to connect with something larger than ourselves gets twisted and distorted.
It's pretty bleak.
It is a bit.
But he also talks about poetry and humor, right?
Yeah.
How do those fit into this picture of the three brains?
Well, Koestler sees poetry and humor as unique ways to bridge the gap between our old and new brains. He describes poetry as a kind of regression in the service of the ego, where the rhythmic language and imagery tap into the emotional power of the old brain,
Uh-huh.
while still conveying sophisticated ideas from the neocortex.
So it's like poetry can speak to both our primal emotions
Right.
and our higher reasoning.
Exactly. And humor, he argues, works by juxtaposing two seemingly incompatible frames of reference, forcing us to see the world in a new and surprising way.
Yeah.
Creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that can be jarring, but also liberating.
So it's like a mental reset button helping us break free from rigid thought patterns.
Precisely. But even with these glimpses of hope, Koestler doesn't sugarcoat the human predicament. He sees this disconnect between our old and new brains as a fundamental challenge. And he proposes a radical solution, mental stabilizers.
Okay, now we're getting to the really controversial stuff.
Yeah.
He's basically talking about manipulating our brains to overcome our flaws, right?
He acknowledges the ethical complexities, but argues that we've already been intervening in the natural course of things to improve our well-being with things like vaccines and antibiotics.
So he's saying if we can manipulate our biology to fight disease, why not manipulate our brains to overcome these self-destructive tendencies?
That's the essence of his argument. He believes that further research into the brain, particularly the interplay between the limbic system and the neocortex, could lead to the development of targeted interventions that would help us achieve a more harmonious state of mind.
But wouldn't that be messing with our very nature?
Right.
What about free will and individuality? These are pretty big questions.
Absolutely. And Koestler doesn't shy away from them. He recognizes the potential dangers of tampering with human nature, but also points out that our nature isn't static.
Right.
It's constantly evolving.
He even brings up the idea of self-directed evolution, right? Like how we've already been shaping our own evolution through things like agriculture, technology, and culture.
Right. He argues that we're already engaged in a kind of unconscious self-modification through these innovations. So the question isn't whether we should intervene in our own evolution, but rather how we can do so consciously and responsibly.
So it's like we're at this crucial point in our evolutionary journey where we need to make some deliberate choices about the path we want to take.
Koestler sees the development of these mental stabilizers as a potential turning point in human history, a chance to correct this evolutionary glitch and create a more harmonious future.
Right.
But he's not advocating for some quick fix or a technological utopia.
Right.
He's calling for a deeper examination of our own nature and a more conscious approach to shaping our future.
This is definitely a lot to process. We've gone from the inner workings of the brain to the grand sweep of human history
Yeah.
and the potential for self-directed evolution. Where do we even go from here? So it feels like we've covered so much ground already, but I'm curious to hear more about Koestler's vision of the future. Like, what does a society with these mentally stabilized individuals actually look like?
Well, he paints a picture of a world where aggression and violence are significantly reduced. Remember, he sees much of human aggression stemming from that disconnect
Yeah.
between the old and new brain, between those primal urges and our rational faculties. And if we could bring those into better balance, he believes we'd see a major shift away from conflict.
Okay, so fewer wars, less crime, more peaceful coexistence.
Yeah,
That does sound appealing, but would this mental stabilization fundamentally change who we are?
right.
Would we still have ambition, drive, creativity?
That's where his concept of self-transcendence becomes really crucial. He believes that urge to connect with something larger than ourselves is at the core of human nature. And it can be channeled in so many different ways. It can fuel our art, our scientific pursuits,
Hmm.
our spiritual journeys,
Yeah.
our desire to build a better society.
So it's not about eliminating our emotions or turning us into robots. It's
Mhm.
about guiding those emotions in a more constructive direction.
Exactly. He sees mental stabilization as enhancing our capacity for self-transcendence, not suppressing it.
Mm.
He believes that by bridging the gap between our old and new brains, we can actually unlock even greater creativity and innovation.
Okay, I can see how that might work, but how would this all play out in practice? Like, what are the concrete changes Koestler envisions in this mentally stabilized world?
He imagines a world where people are more cooperative, more empathetic, more focused on the common good. A shift away from the narrow self-interest and materialism that he sees as the root of so many problems.
So, a world where people are more concerned with helping others solving global challenges, creating a more just and sustainable society. It's a beautiful vision, but is it really achievable? Can we really change human nature that profoundly?
That's the ultimate question, and Koestler acknowledges that it would be a monumental undertaking. It would require not just scientific breakthroughs,
Right.
but a fundamental shift in our values and beliefs.
So, it's not just about popping a pill or undergoing some therapy, it's a
Mm.
much deeper transformation of our individual and collective consciousness.
Exactly. The development of mental stabilizers is just one piece of the puzzle. The real challenge lies in creating a culture that fosters this enhanced self-transcendence. A culture that values cooperation, compassion, and the pursuit of higher ideals.
So, okay, so let's say we somehow managed to achieve all of this. What would this culture actually look like? What kinds of values and beliefs would it emphasize?
Koestler doesn't lay out a specific blueprint,
Okay.
but he offers some intriguing hints. He envisions a society where wisdom and compassion are more highly valued than power and wealth, where individual fulfillment is sought through contribution to the common good rather than through competition and acquisition.
It sounds like a pretty radical departure from our current society,
Yeah.
where individualism and material success are often held up as the ultimate goals.
It would certainly require a major shift in perspective, but Koestler argues that this kind of transformation is not only possible but also necessary if we want to avoid the self-destructive path that he believes we're currently on.
So it's a call to action, a challenge to rethink our priorities and to strive for something greater than ourselves.
That's a great way to put it. He's urging us to recognize the interconnectedness of all things, to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a larger web of life.
Hmm.
And he believes that this expanded sense of self can lead to a more harmonious and fulfilling existence, both for ourselves and for humanity as a whole.
Well, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about today. Koestler's Ghost in the Machine is a truly mind-bending exploration of the human condition. It's challenging, it's provocative, and it definitely leaves us with more questions than answers.
It certainly does.
Mm.
But I think that's the point. Koestler isn't trying to give us all the answers. He's trying to spark a conversation, to challenge us to think critically about who we are, where we're going, and what kind of future we want to create.
And even though it was written over 50 years ago, his insights remain remarkably relevant today. He reminds us that we're not just passive passengers on this journey of evolution. We have the power to shape our own destiny both individually and collectively.
Yeah, that's such an important message. It's not about waiting for some external force to save us or to fix our problems. It's about taking responsibility for our own evolution and using our incredible mental capacities to create a better world.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks to our expert for guiding us through Koestler's thought-provoking ideas. And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this journey of exploration. We hope you found it as stimulating and thought-provoking as we have.